Okay, there we go. As I was saying, that we'll just get into it. So when we think of the civil rights movement and histories of the past, the further back we go, the more detached we are from them. The more we can detach ourselves from them and our views of them, and see the wrong that said histories contained. If we think of slavery, for example, pretty much everyone in today's society will look at you and say slavery is, sorry if there's background, if you can hear background, but yeah, just try to filter that out. Everyone in society today, most people at least, will tell you the ills of owning a person and all that's wrong of that. But as history moves closer towards us, the less people are able to detach from that. You were to ask someone about their perceptions of the civil rights movement, most, again, maybe less, but most people would tell you about the ills of that and would say that they probably would have marched along the streets with Dr. Martin Luther King and stood by his side in protesting what they were protesting. Fast forward a bit more, and again, the sentiments slowly start to dissipate. If you ask about feminists, not too long ago, a lot of us in this movement held anti-feminist sentiments, would use Sister White, if anything, to discourage participating in feminism, the movement of feminism. But generally, people have warmed up to the idea in this movement. And fast forward again, and we think of Stonewall and fighting for the rights of homosexual people. It becomes harder and harder to detach yourself away from that. And the reason why we've had to do this is because of those 126 years of darkness that Adventists specifically were thrown into an apostate Protestant line of thinking. So just to review the study of Apis Bull, when we think of the Israelites and their captivity for 70 years, we know that the Israelites came into captivity in literal Babylon. And that was a 70-year captivity where they worshipped literal idols prior to that captivity. But that captivity within literal Babylon for that 70 years was meant to cure them of that worship of said idolatry. And when they came out, 3 decrees were given. The first and the second was to go back and rebuild the temple. And the third decree, which was given in 457 BC, allowed them some sort of autonomy to rule themselves. And so you don't see any literal idols anymore. That was the form. But these Israelites didn't get rid of the spirit of what those idols represented. To them, that idol specifically that we've been talking about is the Apis Bull, represented a strong god, a male patriarchal god, a god of war, and their perception of God didn't get dealt with in that 70 years of captivity. And so after that captivity, they still had what that bull represented in mind. Go down a few years, and we think of the 1260 years of captivity to spiritual Babylon. to spiritual Babylon. And this was to the mothers of Babylon. And what was the item that God's people, the law that God's people broke, if you want to encapsulate it in that needed them to be vaccinated from, to be steeped into, so that after the process they can come out cured? And I'd suggest that it's Sunday worship. And so they go into this captivity, this 1260 years, immersed in that wine. And when they come out, they're prepared to get rid of that spiritual Babylon mindset. And in 1844, we're given the law. We're given the restoration of the Sabbath. God's people are taught about the Sabbath. Fast forward to the captivity closest to us is that 126 years from 1863 to 1989. And that was the captivity that we would consider to the daughters of Babylon. Daughters of Babylon. So what was it that God's people got immersed in that 126 years that God needed to, now is needing to reform his people from? What mindset was he looking to change, if you want to call it that? And I'd say there's a whole list of them. If we can think of that list, we would think of it as different items ranging from conspiracy theories, the United Nations, wrong ideas of the United Nations and their role, globalism, as we just said, feminism and our views of feminism, the idea of a Christian government and the role that God plays in religious aspects in the ruling of a nation. Socialism, we know that throughout the Cold War era, there was a lot of sermons, if you want to call it that, preached about the ills of socialism and capitalism. The list can go on. All the things that have been discussed over the last 2 years, I would say. And in 2014, when the movement starts to get organized a bit, that gets dealt with. So during that 70 years, you have the problem with literal idols. And if we were to think of the law that needed to be addressed, it would be the first and second commandment, not to make graven images. And these laws thereafter needed to be understood at a spiritual level, because they might have been done away with in form, but the spirit of said idol worship was retained. Therefore, didn't keep those laws in spirit. When we think of the 1260, the Sabbath, and Sunday, which commandment? It would be the fourth. Now, when I ask the 126, what law could we encapsulate this list by? And generally, you could say the last 6 commandments and your relationship to mankind. But the one that I will address is number 9. Thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. If I were to ask you what the definition of a neighbor is, as we would know, it's just another person. And so this command is that you don't bear false witness against any other person. But not only that, it's that we should have a true witness against other people. should have an understanding of the world around us and the people around us so that we don't bear false witness against them. And when you think of these things on the list, conspiracy theories, feminism, wrong ideas of feminism and the role of women in society, conspiracy theories trickling down to conspiracy theories about individuals, we exhibit these things. So if you think that doctors are out there to do you harm, you're bearing false witness against a doctor's character. During this pandemic, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories about Bill Gates. And in doing that, you're bearing false witness about his character and his mission in the world. When you spread conspiracy theories about Jews as gold diggers, as people who are money mongrels, you are bearing false witness against who they really are, So there's a lot of conspiracy theories, ways in which you can bear false witness against your neighbor. People of color, and thinking of them as inferior or as inherently stronger and so able to endure pain more. Different ideas that you have about people that come from conspiracy theories is just boiled down to bearing false witness against our neighbor. And so that's the commandment that really needs to be understood in our time. Because if we are to accurately represent the world around us, we shouldn't intentionally or unintentionally bear false witness against the people around us. There's a book I'm reading, and there's a small chapter that I would like to, not chapter, portion that I'll just read from. It's talking about the brain and new science that is being learnt about the brain. So to quote, it says, what used to be thought fixed and inevitable is being shown to be plastic and flexible. The powerful biology changing effects of our physical, wrong paragraph. Okay, this is the one. One major breakthrough in recent years has been the realization that the brain is much more proactive or forward-thinking with respect to information gathering than we had first realized. It doesn't just respond to the information when it arrives, it generates predictions about what might be coming next, based on the kind of patterns it has identified on previous occasions. If it turns out that things didn't quite work out as planned, then this prediction error, so to speak, will be noted and the guidelines adjusted accordingly. So this is much like the work that I do. We gather data in the field that I work in, and based on that data, look for patterns in the data and try to make predictions about something that would look similar, what it could be. So that's generalizing. It generalizes. And a feat of this is that you can develop the best algorithm, the best machine, if you want to call it that, to make these predictions. But if you feed it with bad data, bad information, the phrase is garbage in, garbage out. If you feed it with bad information, garbage, what you'll get is garbage. And that's much like us. If we think back at the sheep story I told, why the sheep needs to hold its head up and take in as, or at least be humble, and have those pupils as wide as it can, is to be able to take in as much data as it can. Like us, when we look at world events, the reason why we do is to be able to feed this machine that we have in our heads with as much good data as possible. If we have a limited view, we can make wrong predictions. So in order, like the paragraph I just read, to make better predictions, you have to feed your brain with more information. And that's the problem that we fall into as people, that we look at a group of people, a society of people, and based on a limited view of said people, our predictions when we meet someone and we project an image onto that person that we have in our minds. It's limited. And the only way to counter that is to go out and see more, to get more data, to be able to let the story tell itself. If we were to look at the studies that we've done in the past, one of them that sticks out is the studies on Islam, which is a study of Bible prophecy. And with there being a rise, if you want to call it that, or a prevalence of Islamophobia in society today, we as people in the movement need to recognize the necessity of having a correct understanding of Islam, the religion, and Muslims, so that we don't bear false witness against these people when we do approach our studies. And so this study that we're going to go through doesn't discard any of the studies that we've done on Islam in the past, 9/11, the woes, locusts, etc. But it's just so that we have a right framework of our neighbors, so we don't bear false witness against our neighbors. And we're able to open our eyes to our neighbors and have a right understanding of them, so that when we go out to the world, we can represent them correctly. When we approach our studies in the Bible, we can approach them from a right perspective, right frame of mind. If I were to ask you why it is people are racist, or initially were, or people are segregationists, a lot of the time it stems down to fear. And that fear arises through ignorance. If you look at Trump's base in America, a lot of the people are riled up by that. Trump works on that. He breeds fear in the people against minorities, against people of different religions who are of a different skin color, different nations. And the idea is to keep people in ignorance, give them bad data, so that the data that goes in is garbage and all that comes out is garbage. And so how do you come out of this ignorance? It's by acquiring knowledge. It's being able to look at a situation holistically as possible and objectively, so that you get a full picture and can have a right understanding of a certain topic. While ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to having a wrong understanding of the things that we had on this list, which results in conspiracy theories. And that, as we said, inevitably is just bearing false witness against your neighbor. So the purpose, as I said, is to challenge Islamophobia that we may have. And to do that, you would need to reconsider the history of the Muslim people and the history of their religion, Islam. So if we were to open Genesis 16, verse 7 and 8, this takes us to the historical beginnings of Muslim people. Genesis 16 being the story of Hagar, and where Sarah couldn't have a child, so she suggests to Abraham that Abraham sleeps with his handmaid, Hagar. Hagar is then sent away. So I'm going to read from verse 7, Genesis 16, verse 7, which says, "And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai." So a few things to note here is that an angel appears of the Lord to the slave woman. And Ellen White tells us that this angel of the Lord is no less a personage than Jesus Christ. And this angel takes the time to talk to this frightened slave woman. Verse 9, "And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself unto her. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael. because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. So God here takes the time to go and speak to Hagar. And it's the first time in the Bible that an unborn child is named. Ishmael is given the name Ishmael while still in the womb. And he's given one of Abraham's promises, or one of the Abrahamic promises. And the promise that was given to Abraham was that his seed would be like the stars. Many, many generations would come from Abraham. And like Abraham, Ishmael could receive these literal blessings. He inherited the literal blessings, but couldn't necessarily inherit the spiritual blessings. And it's important to keep this in mind as we trace the history of Ishmael's lineage. A religion that, if we look at today, or at the religion itself, is very much based on the literal. And verse 12, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all brethren. And as we understand this to be the wild ass, the wild Arabian ass, who is untamable, in Genesis 25, is sent away to the East Country. And it's through this that the tribes in the Arabian Peninsula are started. What does hand against every man means? Contentious, and dwells in the presence of his brethren, brethren being Isaac and his descendants. And so God's people being descendants from Isaac, we could consider ourselves half siblings to, or Ishmael and his descendants are half siblings to God's people. And this adds to the point that we started with. Yes, everyone is our neighbor, but more so, as our half siblings, it would emphasize the need to not bear false witness against our sisters and brothers. And so it's important not to stereotype every descendant of Ishmael, which is quite easy to do. Easy for the brain to make shortcuts and stereotypes. But just like God looks at every individual as an individual, just like how we, when we spend time with sheep, can look at every sheep as an individual, we need to think using our slow thinking brain and not jump to conclusions. Ishmael, by Muslims, is recognized as the ancestor of several northern Arabian tribes. We fast forward from that time period about 2,500 years, and we look at the nomadic tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. They were very tribal. They used to fight amongst themselves, look after their own kind. And when you belong to a tribe, your protection was basically within that tribe. And people cared with you within that tribe, but very contentious with other tribes. There was no real law governing the people that overarched over all the tribes. And the tribal world really just worked on revenge. And if you attack me, I'm going to attack you. And vendettas. If you killed my brother, I'm going to make it my life's mission to make sure that your family suffers. But within a tribe, it was very much protected. Of these people in the Arabian Peninsula, in that region, amongst those tribes, they were polytheistic, which means that they were idol worshippers, many, many idols. And the center of this idolatry was the city of Mecca. In Mecca, let me get to my pictures. In Mecca, there's a big shrine. Here's a picture of that shrine. And a big cube called the Hajj that they, Muslims, believe that Abraham and Ishmael built. And surrounding the Hajj then were about 360 idols, one of which included Jesus, Mary, and it was, when we think of the Jewish system of worship and the pantheon, this would be the equivalent of the pantheon. So this is a recent picture of Mecca and the Hajj. But then idols would surround all around this central Hajj. And within there, you could find every god you could think of. Mecca, being the hub of trading, needed to have all these gods in that place because everyone would pass through there, and when on pilgrimage, they would want to be able to worship their god, coming from different parts of the world. But these Arabian tribes believed in the God of the Christians and the God of the Jews, and they believed that he was the greatest God, and there was no idol for that one true God. So they made idols for every other god that they believed in, except for this one true God that they, or the greatest God amongst them, sorry, which was the God of the Jews that they believed in and the God of Christians that they believed in. So they didn't make an idol for said God. Now, I want to run through the lineage and lifetime of Muhammad. Muhammad being a interesting person, and the history of him being likewise interesting. I'll go through said history. In 570 AD, Muhammad was born, and his father died a few months before he was born. When his father died, as was common practice, he was given away to one of the surrounding tribes, a Bedouin tribe. And this was generally done where children were sent out of the cities, which had a lot of disease, which weren't really safe. So it was normal to send your child out to a better environment in which they could be raised. And after 2 years, they were brought back. But an interesting thing happened with Muhammad. Instead of staying 2 years, he stayed 5. And so he only returned home when he was 5 years old. And he returned to his mother, who, after the death of Muhammad's father, didn't remarry, which was unusual for people in that area, because widowed women, more often than not, went on to remarry. And after 2 years of his return, Muhammad's mother dies. So in 577, Muhammad's mother dies. And Muhammad's grandfather takes him in to look after him, who then goes on to die. And then Muhammad is taken in by one of his uncles. Muhammad belonged to what was called the Quraysh tribe at the time, which was one of the more powerful, wealthy tribes in the area. So despite Muhammad's humble origins, he still belonged to this tribe that offered a fair bit of protection to him, especially his uncle, who was a trader, who got him working on camels and caravanning and taught him how to trade. So Muhammad worked his way up under the tutelage of his uncle, and he got a really good character painted of him because of how he held himself and how he socialized. A few of the nicknames that he acquired were the trusted one, the truthful one, and he was a very pious person to all those that observed him. In 595 AD, when he was 24 years old, he was employed by a woman whose name was Khadija, who was 15 years older than him, and she sent him out to do jobs. And one specific one was sent him out to Syria on a caravanning trip with some goods, and when he returned, said Khadija, whom he had started working for, got a liking to him, and so they got married. And they stayed married for about 24 years, a happy monogamous marriage, and he continued to work for her. In this time, Mecca got richer and richer, but the value of the tribes went down. So as Mecca's wealth increased, the surrounding tribes' wealth decreased. The next date that I'll mark is 610 AD. At this point, Muhammad is now 40 years old. He's lived his life with Khadija by his side, and he's had 4 daughters. His son died at birth, one of his sons, but Muhammad had a good relationship with his daughters, the youngest one being Fatima. When this occurs at 40 years old, Muhammad goes into the mountains for his yearly pilgrimage to pray and fast, which he normally did regularly. If we were to think of the Hajj, the picture we saw earlier, and pilgrimages to the Hajj and Ramadan, they existed way before Islam was formalized as a religion. And this was just a normal cultural practice. What Islam did is took all these cultural practices and reformed them into these cultural practices and incorporated them into the religion. So Muhammad goes into the mountain, and as the story goes, is that the angel Gabriel appeared to him, who tells him, recite. And Muhammad is terrified and asks this angel, what? Why? What do you want me to recite? And the angel keeps telling him, recite, recite, recite. Muhammad is confused at this point, and then that's when the angel, as the story goes, gives Muhammad the very first words of the Quran, and the meaning of Quran is recite, recitation. Frightened, he's told to recite these words, which Muhammad does, and he goes back home to his wife Khadija and tells her what happened. Khadija looks at him and says, Muhammad, this is startling news. You very might well be the prophet for this people. And they go to this wife's Christian cousin, who says that, Muhammad, God is speaking to you. These are revelations. You're a prophet. Muhammad keeps this to himself and doesn't receive any other revelations for about 2 years. And he starts to feel abandoned. Then the angel appears to him and tells him that he hasn't been abandoned, and these revelations start happening again. After 3 years, he starts going public. He's told to recite, and so he does. He recites what has been revealed to him to the public. Now, within the Arabian world at that time, we can think of Egypt as having hieroglyphics, and they would make an art form of it. When we think of the Greeks and the Romans, they express themselves in their paintings and the sort. But within the Arabian world, there was none of that. What they expressed themselves with was poetry, their writing, and this was way before Islam. Arabians were known for their poetry, where they'd sit around the fire and recite poems. If we were to look at the Quran and in English, it would be lost in translation to us. We wouldn't recognize the beauty of it. And it's much like us taking Shakespeare and translating it into French, where it doesn't seem so fluid to them. In Zimbabwe, whenever people would, I don't speak the local language, Shona, and whenever people would tell jokes in Shona and they would fall off their chair laughing, I'd ask, what did you say? And they'd tell it to me in English, and it would sound so dry, just like not a funny joke. And then they'd explain to me, lost in translation, it's a lot funnier in the language. And that's much like the Quran. It's a beautiful piece of literature put together within the language, but when we read it in English, it doesn't have that same poetic beauty. So this is how Muhammad spread his message. It was by reciting these revelations in poetry form, and that's what came to be the verses of the Quran that were given to him by the angel, and that's how he evangelized. So in, whoops. So in 613 AD, he noted that that's when Muhammad goes public with his recitations. And in 614, he starts to be persecuted. The message that was given to Muhammad that he would go around preaching was that there was really only one true God. And what was in Mecca? Many gods. They were polytheistic. And so this message that Muhammad was preaching struck at the very heart of the Meccans. That, what? You're telling us that there's only one true God. And so that struck at their nationalism, who they were, the jobs that they had. So while Muhammad started to gather a following as well, he started to be persecuted, and this persecution grew, and they were crucified. A lot of these followers that Muhammad gained started fleeing to countries such as Ethiopia. So in 614, we see persecution starting. In 619, what came to be known as the Year of Sorrows, Khadija, his wife, and his uncle, who looked after him and raised him, both died. And so Muhammad found himself in a sticky situation. He's in trouble because his uncle was his protector. His uncle, being a wealthy person, one of status, could protect Muhammad. And when Muhammad started evangelizing, his business started to decrease because no one really wanted to do business for him. And so his wife sponsored him, and etc., etc. So Muhammad stops getting business. His immediate family, if you want to call it that, is now dead. And his message was not only centered on ridding the city of idols, but included social justice as well, which attracted the poor and the underclasses. People who weren't part of his tribe, he argued for their care. Now, this was strange. This was new. This was something that the Meccans specifically, or anyone for that matter, wasn't used to. But Muhammad started getting a following. And the things that they used to do as tribes and stopped doing was this, caring for each other. And the tribes then turned into tribal warfare. And Muhammad was encouraging them to go back to their old way of life, of stopping the greed and licentiousness of the people. In 620, he had the famous vision that most of us have heard them claim that Muhammad had, which was the vision of him being taken up into heaven and seeing all the prophets of old, Moses and the sort. But in 622, which is 2 years later after that famous vision, which came to be known as the night flight to Medina. In 622, there was this town to the northwest of Mecca, where Mecca was situated, called Yathrib. And Yathrib was in a bit of turmoil. There was fighting amongst surrounding tribes that surrounded Yathrib. And people would take pilgrimages to Mecca. And on one specific occasion, a group of people took a pilgrimage to Mecca. And they heard of Muhammad, and they heard about the message that he was preaching, and they liked it. And so they asked him to bring his message to Yathrib. And if in any way this message and this person could bring peace to the surrounding tribes. So he agreed. But because he had so much animosity against him and his family now, he decided to send his family and friends ahead of him. So they go at night, and then he followed a bit later. Yathrib is today what we would know as Medina, one of the hotly disputed regions of the area. And so Muhammad gets to Medina, Yathrib, and starts sharing his message. And they make him a civil governor. So he's not just a religious leader anymore preaching his message. They've made him a civil one too. And he sorts out their problems, and in doing so manages to convert all those surrounding tribes to Islam. So this then spreads throughout Arabia to other regions as well, where there are more converts to Islam at this point. Now problems start to arise as Meccans start fearing that Muhammad, in doing this, has gathered enough people to go and make war against the Meccans. And so they look at him as a troublemaker that they need to get rid of. I'm just going to continue this timeline underneath for space. I'm not trying to overlay them on top of each other. And from 623 to 624, a few skirmishes occur. They called wars, but they weren't really big. It was just small, as I said, skirmishes, where Meccans would come against Medina and try to fight against them. So while Muhammad was in Mecca in those early years of his life, living in Mecca, the revelations given to him would constantly tell him not to fight back. Don't retaliate against the persecution. Just take it, and much like the disciples that we can think of, just take the persecution. And that was what Muhammad did, and that's what his followers did while he was in Mecca. But once he was made ruler in Medina, revelations come that, okay, you can fight back now, but there's conditions. So if we were to think of the violence that was given, the mandate that was given to Muhammad and his follower was that violence wasn't mandated, but was allowed under certain conditions. So the messages change. So there's these two messages that he gets, dependent on where he was, Medina versus when his time in Mecca. If you were to look at, ask, and read how clerics within Islam teach, the Muslim academics and theologians, they'll tell you that to understand the Quran, you have to take it in its historical context. So they look at his early recitations, and they understand that in his context when he was in Mecca, and the difference between that and Medina. So to Islamic theologians, context was very important, understanding why certain things are said in the Quran dependent on context. In Medina, he's now a person of responsibility. He's looking after people. And so this violence, as the revelations to him suggested, was permitted, being a ruler, looking after more people. But the people in Medina still need to be able to go to Mecca for pilgrimage. And in 628, and in 628 AD, the Medinans and the Meccans come to a treaty. They form a treaty where he and about 10,000 people from the surrounding tribes start marching to Mecca because they want to go on pilgrimage. And the Meccans come out and they say, hold up. Let's make a treaty, okay? They're scared, obviously, because this is a large group of people. And so they make peace. The Meccans say to Muhammad and all that he's with, all the people that he's with, come back next year and we'll let you do your pilgrimage. And so they pack up and they agree, okay, next year we'll come back. In 629, they come back, they march on Mecca, and they told, nope, next year, come back next year. They break the treaty. And so Muhammad and all those around him say, no, next year we are going to make pilgrimage, whether they like it or not. And then comes 6:30, and they indeed march on Mecca. The Meccans come out with their hands up and they surrender, and Mecca is conquered that year. But there's no bloodshed, there's no killing. What Muhammad does is he goes into Mecca and he cleans up all the idols, reorganizes the city, all those enemies that he had in places of power, he replaces them with people aligned to his cause, and everyone converts to Islam, and he goes back to Medina, where he dies 2 years later in 632 AD. Muhammad dies.
Curtis,
So in that, yeah.
Apologies about the interruption. Just a time check. 20 minutes left.
Okay. Get me off right. But yeah, thank you. So Muhammad dies 2 years later in 632 AD. One thing I want to note is that when the Meccans came out and surrendered, one of Muhammad's followers asked, "What if they attack us? Not everyone is so welcoming." And Muhammad replies, "You may kill the unbelievers." So what's important to note is that when you read the Quran and these words in context, and it's one of the verses in the Quran that's quoted a lot, kill unbelievers. When you read it in historical context, an unbeliever was a polytheistic Meccan. Jews and Christians were not unbelievers because they believed in a God, the God that Muhammad was trying to get people to believe in. And it was only these polytheistic idol worshippers that he considered as unbelievers. And in Medina, there were several Jews and Christians, thousands of them, who weren't forced to become Islam. They were allowed to live there, allowed to be whatever religion that they wanted. They just had to pay a tax if they weren't Muslim. Muhammad was what we would call pluralistic. They believed that Jews and Christians were people of the book, that the Quran, these revelations, were just extensions of the Old and New Testament. Again, I'm just relaying to you how they see it. If we are to understand people better and see things from their perspective, and that's the best way to understand the people, is to let you tell their story, so you have a better perception of who they are, and not to project what you see them as. And so, as I said, I'm just relating to you how they view it. So they would consider Jews and Christians as believers. Muhammad replies to this person who questions him, only if they attack you first, and only if they stop you from reaching the shrine, and only if the truce is broken, and we try to renegotiate, and they don't accept the renegotiations, then you can attack. So in essence, he says, you can attack, but it's better if you don't. If all these options have been exhausted, then okay, attack. So they march on Mecca. Muhammad doesn't take the throne within Mecca. As I said, he just sets it in order, and he returns to Medina, where he dies. Muhammad, in the region of the Arabian Peninsula, was considered a master negotiator, and that's how he pretty much conquered all of that peninsula and converted everyone to Muslim or Islam by 22 years old. If I were to ask you what Islam means, it means submit, surrender. Islam meaning submit. A Muslim person would be someone who has submitted or surrendered their life to the one true God. That's the force of their message, really. That there's only one true God, and you must submit, surrender to that one true God. If we look at all the religions in the world, we understand that every religion pretty much has a perception of what's wrong with the world. and provides what they have in mind to be the answer or the solution to what's wrong with the world. And what Muhammad perceived as being wrong with the world is that people weren't surrendered to that one true God. People were self-sufficient. And this is what happened in Mecca. As long as you had a job, as long as you had money, you really didn't need God. And God was pushed to the periphery of your life. So Muhammad wanted God to be the number one God in your life. When God isn't the number one thing in your life, you end up replacing him with an idol. And that's why they were against with idol worshippers, worshipping idols, because you submitted to one God. So whether that God was your money or your wealth, like the Meccans, or a graven image, anything, the whole purpose of Islam to Muhammad was to take you back to the worship of God as a priority in your life. When I relate to, I'm just going to talk about Muhammad's wives. Muhammad's wives, his first being Khadija, whom he was married to for 24 years. He had children with her, 4 children, 1 son who passed away, so 4 daughters. And when he passed away, he remarried to a woman named Aisha. Aisha was the young daughter of Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr was one of his many companions. If we think of Revelation 9, that's the same Abu Bakr. He was the one who made the decree not to touch those that have the seal of God in their foreheads. That's that Abu Bakr. Muhammad did marry other wives, 11 in total. The other 9, so not Khadija and not Aisha, were widows, but he had no children with them. As the custom and culture of the time was, when a woman died, you would take in that woman at the time to look after that widow. You'd take that widow into your household, and that's how said widows were provided for. I'm going to show you a small map. This is the map of that Arabian Peninsula, which today is Saudi Arabia. Mecca is there near the Red Sea, and through the northwest is Medina. You can see that this is what he managed to unite in those 22 years that he spent on his mission, all converting to Islam. Family tree of Muhammad. So as I said, this is just a simplified version of Muhammad's family tree, and it's just to point out a few characters here. Khadija, his first wife, that you see on the left there, and his second wife, Aisha. And Muhammad's last daughter, Fatima, then married Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin. Ali being the son of the uncle that took him in and provided for him and protected him. He had those 4 children, Hassan, Hussein, Zainab, al-Qasim, and Hassan and Hussein become important in history, as does Ali, who is considered a blood relative of Muhammad, and his progeny is considered important in Islamic tradition. So just to keep that in mind as we progress. There are 5 key pillars, to the Islamic religion and their beliefs, that encapsulates their beliefs. The first one is Shahada, which is their profession of faith, which is basically the belief that there's only one true God, and Muhammad is the messenger of that God. This is central to Islam. When you convert to Islam, you're brought inside a mosque with your friends or family, anyone who can be a witness to this, and you recite something and somebody's present, you would then be considered a convert. This would be the profession of your faith. The second pillar is prayer, which is salat. The fact that they pray 5 times a day, and it's connected to the theme of God being a central pillar in your life. You praying 5 times a day is your communication with said God. The third is zakat, which is the giving of alms. Every Muslim needs to pay 2.5% of their wealth to the poor. It's charity. And so this was 2.5% of all your wealth. So not just your income, but your total wealth. And this goes directly to the poor. It doesn't go to the imam. It doesn't go to the construction of mosques. It doesn't go to decorations or painting for the mosque. It goes to the poor. And it didn't matter the religion or the country where this donation goes to. It could go to anyone. The fourth pillar of Islam would be fasting, which is called Sawm. And again, this is just emphasizing that they believe that God is a priority in your life. And we know that to be Ramadan today. The fifth is Hajj, which is just pilgrimage. So in a Muslim's life, at least one time in their life, if they're physically able or financially able, and those conditions are met, then they should go at least once on pilgrimage. If not, then don't go. If you go and you can't provide for your family while you're gone, don't go. The next picture that I'll show you is just this divide amongst Sunni and Islam, where that divide came from. When Muhammad was on his deathbed and the family was preparing for his funeral, some of Muhammad's companions got together to find who would replace him as the political leader. It was just looking for a suitable candidate to replace him as a political leader, not as a religious leader. And the first replacement that they came with was Abu Bakr, that companion of his. After Abu Bakr passed away, up stood Umar. And Umar was assassinated, and then Uthman was the replacement given. The fourth, Ali, who was Muhammad's blood cousin. Now, this is the difference between Shiites and Sunnis. It's that they disagree over who should have replaced Muhammad. Sunnis believe that it should have been his companions. So these first 4 caliphs that you see are known as Rashidun caliphs, which means that they're honored. Shiites, however, see the first 3 as usurpers. They took the throne or took the governance illegally. They were illegal followers of Muhammad. And the first caliph, the first replacement, really should have been Ali in the first place. So this is where the split between the 2 groups come from. And there was war at the time. It was the first civil war amongst them. And it gets settled and worked out pretty quickly. They lived peacefully for hundreds of years, up until 1979, when we see Iran and Saudi Arabia, who were once allies, become rivals now. And we see that the Sunni and Shia split began again. But for many years, they had lived pretty much peacefully together. Another date I'd like to mark is 637 AD. And this is when they take Jerusalem. So after Muhammad, Islam spreads, and not long after, before it spread through the whole peninsula, the whole Middle East pretty much was Islam. And they go and take Jerusalem in 637, as I said. So in Jerusalem, there were Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and everyone pretty much got along well. There would be skirmishes and arguments, but pretty much it was peaceful. For Christians and Jews, pilgrimage to Jerusalem was permitted as long as these Christians and Jews paid their fair share of taxes. Islam wasn't a pacifist religion. It didn't condone violence, but it allowed violence. Muhammad, in his life, wasn't considered a violent man. He was considered quite progressive, actually, when it came to women, and he mandated that women should be educated. If we think of his second wife, Aisha, she was highly trained and took positions in civil and religious matters. He believed in the education of girls and put laws in place to stop the killing of baby girls, because you would want a male son in the culture at that time for various reasons, but he put laws in place that stopped that female infanticide. He said to women that they should be able to get an inheritance as well, which meant that they could go on and receive property and own their own businesses. And so when you read the Quran, there's verses that are not so pro-women and verses that are, but that's much like the Old Testament and the New Testament that we view today. So these people living at that time are still kind of affected by their 7th century patriarchal ideas, but Muhammad was still pretty much considered a radical progressive to his counterparts. If we think of the hijab and the burqa, that came in many generations after. It was the Persian culture that imposed itself on the Islam religion. It wasn't considered Islamic at the time of Muhammad, and you won't find that anywhere in the Quran. So it's much like how cultures today impose their culture on the Bible or on Christianity. So in 637 AD, Jerusalem is taken. Fast forward to the year 1099, and this was the year of the First Crusade. Pope Urban II in France gave a speech and declared that they should go on a holy war to go and reclaim this lost territory that had been taken over by Muslims and get it back for God. This is a map of that First Crusade and all that transpired. It's showing Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. That olive green part is what was conquered by Islam at the time. The yellow part in the top left is the Church of Rome and their territory, and that pink region was the land that the Orthodox Church had. So within the Latin Church, there was this split. So there's the Church of Rome, and it goes through the split. So the Orthodox Church, at the time of this First Crusade, sends word to their Western brothers and asks for a hand because they've gotten themselves into a bit of trouble. And the Pope, Urban II, says, okay, we'll give you a hand, and while doing that, we'll go and get our land back, Jerusalem. And they use this. Urban, who had been facing trouble in his land, uses this as a distraction and sets off on this campaign. Now, of the armies that were sent forth from the Pope and the governors, some of them left too early, and they get there in the spring. And so there's nothing to eat when they start marching on Jerusalem and through the areas. And so they pillage the villages, they kill Jews on the way, and people who went, the people that did go, weren't necessarily soldiers. They were poor and not really organized. This was the First Crusade, not really organized, and so it was really just a mess. And the first army arrives in Jerusalem in 1099. They killed everyone in 2 days. It's said that they killed up to 70,000 people, killed Jews and Muslims alike. And the city stunk for months and took over this area. Going back to our board. 88 years later, so here's the First Crusade from 1099. And 88 years later, Muslims start getting more organized and decide that they want to fight back against these Christians, in inverted commas, that have taken their land. And in 1187, a sultan called Saladin stands up, who was known for his generosity, his piety. He was devoid of fanaticism. Went on this campaign to take the land back. I'll read something from an article that describes this Sultan. Saladin was known for his generosity, his piety, devoid of fanaticism. During the European conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders slaughtered Muslims, Jews, and fellow Christians who weren't European like them. Slaughtered Christians if they weren't white Europeans. They raped women and smashed babies against walls in a brutal and barbaric raid over the Holy Land. 88 years later, when Sultan Saladin defeated the Crusaders and entered Jerusalem, in the cities, Christians feared for their lives and were absolutely certain that the Muslims would avenge the injustices suffered upon them when the Christian Crusaders captured the cities. Monks concealed their treasures and holy scriptures for fear of being looted, while terrified Christian mothers shaved their daughters' heads, trying to disguise them as boys so they wouldn't be raped. As had been the case when Muslim girls were raped when the Christians took over Jerusalem. They were essentially projecting their mentality onto the Muslim army that came to liberate the holy city. If they did that to them, they would certainly do that to us, so they thought. But when Sultan Saladin entered Jerusalem as the victor, he ordered that no Christians should be killed in retaliation. Children, women, and the elderly were not only spared their lives, but Saladin ordered that they should not be taken into captivity and sold as slaves, which would be perfectly fitting and justified, considering the fact that taking slaves into captivity was considered the universal convention of the day. Instead, he let them continue with their lives and did not inflict their families with any cause for concern. Additionally, the Sultan granted all Christians, pilgrims, and merchants from foreign lands the opportunity to return home safely, and without fear of being harmed or fear of being taken captive by his forces, also permitted to take all their property with them. As there were some women and children, Saladin made sure that they were reunited with their male relatives so they wouldn't be harassed or harmed on their journey home. Eastern Christians, who were native to the city, Saladin granted them permanent rights to stay in their homes and neighborhoods, whilst also reinstating the rights of every Jew to visit and resettle in Jerusalem after they were banished and persecuted by the Christian Crusaders. He conquered Jerusalem on a Saturday and ordered that the churches be open for services the following Sunday. He then ordered for the places of worship to be purified, and as the Crusaders had left feces and filth all over the place, while converting some places of worship into war stables. Saladin participated in this task by taking rose water and scrubbing the floor with his own hands. His soldiers followed his example and spent the whole week washing and cleaning the filth that was left on Jerusalem's streets and buildings. When they were done, Jerusalem was purified, and the sweet aroma of roses could be smelt everywhere. So reading about that history of Saladin and what he did to go and liberate the city that he had once conquered from these Christian Crusaders, it paints a very different picture of the barbaric Muslims that the Christian Crusaders were rising up to fight against in this time period. So we see that the caricatured stereotypes that we get of Muslims as being barbarians, child killers, as Jews being child killers, this is all just propaganda that's come out of these crusades and what people projected onto Muslim people based on what they themselves had done. There were many crusades. There wasn't just that one. History gives us 4, but there were about 200 to 300 within that 200 to 300 year space. There were lots more crusades that weren't just against Muslims. They were against Jews, other Christians, wars in the West against the Albigenses. They were considered crusades as well. In doing that, on these crusades, they gathered people into their armies based on propaganda of what projections they were placing on these foreign people. Jews and Muslims were pretty much boxed together as child killers, baby eaters, barbarians, and with this propaganda managed to gather people to their forces. History tells us there was good and bad on both sides, but it wasn't all that we see. So like Elder Parminder taught those studies, what you see is not all there is. So there's many good reports, even during these crusades, that they still did a lot of trading amongst themselves, Muslims and Christians working together. Sometimes Muslims would be mercenaries for the side of the Christians and vice versa. It was a very messy time period. So it wasn't so black and white as one group was bad, one group was good. There was just a very messy time. So when we think of these crusades, we come down to 2001, a time period. So after all this has happened, we come down to 2001. And after that bombing, George Bush stands up and declares that let's go on a crusade.
Brother Curtis,
Yeah,
just to let you know, you're gone over by 5 minutes, but if you need more time, that's fine.
I'll be about 5 minutes left, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Carry on.
So George Bush announces, let's go on this crusade. In 2009, on June 4, Obama gives a speech. He's just been inaugurated, and it's his first trip to the Middle East. And in this speech, he says, quoting Barack Obama, "I am honored to be in the timeless city of Cairo and to be hosted by two remarkable institutions. For over 1,000 years, Al-Azhar has stood as a beacon of Islamic learning, and for over a century, Cairo University has been a source of Egypt's advancement. Together, you represent the harmony between tradition and progress. I am grateful for your hospitality and the hospitality of the people of Egypt. I am also proud to carry with me the goodwill of the American people and a greeting of peace from Muslim communities in my country. Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you. We meet at a time of tension between the United States and Muslims around the world. Tension rooted in historical forces that go beyond any current policy debate. The relationship between Islam and the West includes centuries of coexistence and cooperation, but also conflict and religious wars. More recently, has been fed by colonialism that denied rights and opportunities to many Muslims, and a Cold War in which Muslim-majority countries were too often treated as proxies without regard to their own aspirations. Moreover, the sweeping change brought by modern times and globalization led many Muslims to view the West as hostile to the traditions of Islam. Violent extremists have exploited these tensions in a small but potent minority of Muslims. The attacks of September 11, 2001, and the continued efforts of these extremists to engage in violence against civilians has led some in my country to view Islam as inevitably hostile, not only to America and Western countries, but also to human rights. This has bred more fear and mistrust. So long as our relationship is defined by our differences, we will empower those who sow hatred rather than peace, and who promote conflict rather than the cooperation that can help all of our people achieve justice and prosperity. This cycle of suspicion and discord must end. I have come here to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world." This speech that Barack Obama gave was entitled "A New Beginning." A new beginning of relationships between those in the Middle East and America. And it set the tone for pretty much Obama's foreign policy and work with the Middle East at the beginning of his presidency. In 2012, Obama stands before the UN, the General Assembly, and on September 25 gives another speech. I won't read it all. I'll just read a segment from it. And there was a specific part of this speech that upset Protestant America that was listening in America. He said, "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam." So this was taken and aired on Fox News, and Protestant America was sent up in a fit. But when read in context, it reads, "It is time to leave the call of violence and politics of division behind. On so many issues, we face a choice between the promise of the future or the prisons of the past, and we cannot afford to get it wrong. We must seize this moment, and America stands ready to work with all who are willing to embrace a better future. The future must not belong to those who target Coptic Christians in Egypt. It must be claimed by those in Tahrir Square who chanted, 'Muslims, Christians, we are one.' The future must not belong to those who bully women. It must be shaped by girls who go to school and those who stand for a world where our daughters can live their dreams just like our sons. The future must not belong to those corrupt few who steal a country's resources. It must be won by students and entrepreneurs, the workers and business owners who seek a broader prosperity for all. Those are the women and men that America stands with. Theirs is the vision we will support. The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam, but to be credible, those who condemn the slander must also condemn the hate we see in the images of Jesus Christ that are desecrated, or the churches that are destroyed, or the Holocaust that is denied." So I just wanted to place that. He says, "Let us condemn incitement against Sunni Muslims and Shiite pilgrims." And then he goes on to quote Gandhi and tolerance. The last one, and I'll read very quickly, is in 2014. I'll just read a very small portion of that 2014 press statement on September 10. He says, "Now let's make two things clear. ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim, and ISIL is certainly not a state. It was formerly Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Iraq and has taken advantage of sectarian strife and Syria's civil war to gain victory on both sides of the Iraq-Syrian border." And then he goes on to talk about Iraq. So this statement that he says ISIL is not Islamic had Fox News and the Protestant world upset, because they pretty much put them all in one basket. So when you look at this time period of 2001 to 2004, internally we were having our increase of knowledge and formalization on the message of time. And we know that the world wasn't being plowed in this time. So during this time period of 2001 to 2014, it's a period where we, as people in the movement, really should have been listening to Obama and what he had to say. So that when we looked at the prophecy of 2001 and what happened at 9/11, that we take these words that Obama has uttered and connect them to prophecy, so that we have a correct understanding of the Muslim people. And so there's much to be learned when you consider these speeches by Barack, these important waymarks along our line that contributed to our internal message. What was happening externally really could have benefited us and our studies about 9/11. And that's where FFA went wrong, or at least where what happens when you project humanity onto a God-given message is that you look at a study with tinted glasses, as has been the case, and why we have been relatively silent about Islam and the study of Islam. Okay, I'm wrapping to a close. When we think of the 126 years that Adventism was in apostate Protestant thinking, what they immersed themselves in for those 126 years, and what we as a people have to come out of and be progressive towards, is working to come out of those prejudiced, bigoted thoughts, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, or xenophobia. All these misconceptions we may have had towards Muslims and Islam all need to be corrected. and we need to not bear false witness against other people. So considering all this, it doesn't mean that we look at Islam as being a legitimate religion. We understand that the counterfeit religions in the world wouldn't be counterfeits if they didn't resemble true religion. But it's in order to enable us to look at every individual as an individual, and that these caricatures or misunderstandings that we've had of what their religion represent doesn't form our basis of thinking. Christianity itself has some things wrong with it, but through the years, God has changed the way we look at those things, and unfortunately, it has developed right-wing fundamentalists, which are extremists that we see popping up around the world, much like Islam. And so a reform line that we have is about bringing out these truths, the gems that shine, and dispels darkness. But it should also dispel the darkness that we have and the erroneous thinking that we have of other human beings. If you were to count all the Muslims in the world, there's about 1.8 billion Muslims, and that's the second largest religion. The mountain that's going to make up, that's going to be formed at the end, a large portion of that mountain are going to come from the Muslim population. So there's a lot that could be said of Islam and Muslims. I still have a bit of notes here, but just for time's sake, I'll pull it to a wrap. But the purpose of this study and this going through the life of Muhammad and Islam and how it came to be is just to help us be aware that there's more to history than what propaganda has shown. There's like us who look at the Bible and read it in context. Muslim clerics and religious leaders will tell you that you need to look at the Quran in context as well. So, like sheep, when we look at Muslim people and look at them, it's important for us to hear them tell their story. And as I said, it's not to legitimize their religion. Where they fall off is that they don't recognize Christ as God and just assigning him the role as prophet. But there's a lot of things that we would say we believe in as well. And so just to reiterate the point that the caricatures that we have painted of Muslim people is bearing false witness against them. And it's that us clearing up those misconceptions of what has been put into our minds in those 126 years is our job. And that means people whom we disagree with, not bearing false witness against them. So I do pray that we may have learned something. I certainly did when going through this of Muhammad and his life and Islam in general. And there's still a lot more that can be said, as I said. I'll close with a word of prayer. Our Father art in heaven, I thank you very much for the opportunity to share with your people. I pray that I may have learned something and someone else may have learned something, O Lord, that it is our duty to look at individuals as individuals, Lord. Everyone is unique, and that's so beautiful that you are able to recognize those unique traits in each and every one of us. And I pray and ask that when we look at Muslim people and the Islamic religion, what has developed over the years due to propaganda and caricatures, ill-placed caricatures, we may be able to differentiate between that and truth. And it's really just so that we don't bear false witness against our neighbors. I pray and ask that you may be with us in our studies as we start dealing with the study of Islam more and more, and the role that it is still to play in Bible prophecy. We may be able to look at those studies without tinted glasses, with one that doesn't look at them with prejudice or animosity towards the people. but stand outside a field and look objectively at what you're trying to show us. I pray, thanking you for this opportunity. I pray that the Sabbath may be a blessing to each and every one of us the rest of the day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.